Jake Turner sat alone in the creaky old family house in Willow Creek, a forgotten speck of a town amid Iowa's endless cornfields. The two-story wooden home groaned with every gust of wind, as if whispering secrets it had witnessed over nearly 2 decades. Tonight, March 19th, 2025, the air felt colder than usual, not from the weather, but from what Jake had just uncovered. On the weathered kitchen table, under the flickering glow of a yellow bulb, sat a rusted tin box he'd stumbled upon while clearing out the attic. Inside were relics, a tarnished silver necklace, faded family photos, and a handwritten letter sealed with cracked red wax. The envelope bore his name, to Jake, in a shaky, slanted script. Not his father's, who died 3 years ago of cancer, but eerily like his mother's, a woman he barely remembered from when he was 8. Jake took a deep breath, his trembling hands breaking the seal. The words inside were scrawled in haste. Jake, if you're reading this, forgive me. The truth isn't what they told you. Trust no one. If you're brave enough, find me. Dig me up. I'm not at peace. The final line hit him like a punch to the chest. His mother, Emily Turner, had died 18 years ago, on a frigid winter day in 2007. The family called it a sudden illness, but no one ever elaborated. Her funeral was rushed, his father shedding no tears, just averted gazes and hushed murmurs from neighbors. Jake remembered the unease of standing by her closed casket, never seeing her one last time. Now, this letter, a call from the grave, stirred doubts he'd buried for nearly 2 decades. He stood, stepping onto the porch, letting the cold wind slice through his thin shirt. The faint moonlight illuminated the fields, and beyond them, Willow Creek Cemetery, where his mother lay. Dig her up? The thought was insane, terrifying, yet it rooted itself in his mind like a curse. Jake was no longer the scared 8-year-old boy. At 26, he lived alone, unbound by family or ties. If his mother wasn't at peace, he had to do something. But he knew, once he dug into that grave, there'd be no turning back. Jake couldn't sleep that night. He sprawled on the old sofa in the living room, staring at the cracked ceiling, letting his mind drift to the past. Memories of his mother were always hazy, like scattered puzzle pieces. He recalled her lavender-scented perfume and the soft lullabies she sang to him each night. But his last memory of her was a chilling void. The day she died, Jake was playing in the backyard with Rusty, their old dog. He heard his father's scream, a raw, panicked sound, echo from inside. Rushing in, he found his mother motionless on the kitchen floor, eyes closed, her face pale as wax. His father, Henry, knelt beside her, muttering something Jake couldn't catch. Then everything blurred. Ambulances arrived, but without sirens or urgency. They said she'd had a stroke, but even as a child, Jake sensed something off. The funeral was a jumbled mess in his mind. The casket stayed closed, no explanation given. His father stood like a statue, dry-eyed, saying only, "Your mom's gone." Aunt Mary, his mother's sister, sobbed uncontrollably, but her glare at Henry burned with rage. Neighbors whispered. Words like unnatural and suspicious reached Jake's ears. One mentioned a bruise on her neck, but when he asked his father, Henry snapped at him to shut up and never spoke of it again. Now, those details sharpened in his mind. Why a closed casket? Why no proper memorial? Why did his father, in his final years, avoid mentioning her, as if she were a ghost he wanted erased? Jake sat up, sweat beading on his forehead. The letter on the kitchen table seemed to stare back, whispering, "Dig me up." He stepped outside again, this time with a flashlight. The cemetery was less than a mile away, but the idea of going there at night made his heart pound. He told himself he'd just look, to prove he wasn't losing it. Deep down, though, he knew he'd already decided. Rain began falling as Jake drove his beat-up pickup to Willow Creek Cemetery. He brought a shovel, a rope, and a cheap bottle of whiskey, to warm himself or quiet his conscience. Rain pattered on the windshield, mingling with his heavy breaths. The cemetery loomed in his headlights, gray tombstones standing silent like ghosts in the downpour. Jake killed the engine, stepped out, letting the rain soak his worn jacket. He pulled up his hood, but water still streamed down his neck, icy as phantom fingers. He found her grave easily, a small stone reading, "Emily Turner, 1975 to 2007, beloved mother." No flowers, No candles, no sign of visitors in years. Jake knelt, pressing his hand to the wet earth, feeling it pulse beneath his fingers. He uncorked the whiskey, took a long swig. The burn slid down his throat, but it couldn't chase away the chill in his soul. "What am I doing?" he muttered. But the letter in his pocket blazed like a command. "Dig me up." He started digging. Each shovelful sliced into the past, into memories, into fear. The wet, heavy soil clung to the blade, but Jake didn't stop. Rain thickened, turning dirt to mud that caked his boots and jeans. He dug in silence. Only the patter of rain, the thud of the shovel, and his ragged breathing filling the night. After nearly 2 hours, the shovel hit something hard, coffin wood. He froze, heart hammering. This was his chance to turn back, pretend this never happened. But his hands moved on their own, driven by an unseen force. Jake tied the rope around the coffin lid, yanking it open. The wood, rotted in parts after 18 years underground, still held its secret tight. He took a deep breath, the damp earth smell mixing with something odd, not decay, but a faint lavender scent, like his mother's perfume. He flicked on the flashlight, its beam cutting through the rain, illuminating the coffin. When the lid fully gave way, what he saw nearly made him drop the light. His mother's skeleton lay there, impossibly intact. Not a bone decayed, not a trace of rot. The bones gleamed white under the flashlight, pristine as if just cleaned. The skull tilted slightly, as if gazing at him, and between the ribs, a scrap of faded green fabric, perhaps from her burial dress, clung on. Jake stood frozen, rain streaking his face, dripping into the coffin. After 18 years, there should have been dust and ruin, yet she lay there, as if asleep, as if waiting. He knelt beside the coffin, hands trembling on its splintered edge. "Mom," he whispered, voice breaking in the rain. He hadn't known what to expect, a rotting corpse, shattered bones, or an empty box. But this defied everything. The skeleton wasn't just whole. It held an eerie calm, as if Emily Turner had lain here 18 years to meet him, to tell him a story she couldn't in life. Jake swept the light closer, searching for answers. No preservatives, no plastic, just wood, mud, and this miracle. Then he saw it, between the skeletal fingers of her right hand, a folded scrap of paper, gripped tight, as if she'd held it to her last breath. His shaking hand reached out, brushing cold bone, and gently pulled it free. Under the flashlight, he unfolded it. The scrawl matched the attic letter. "They killed me. Find Henry." Henry, his father's name. Jake felt his blood turn to ice. He looked up at the skeleton, and for a mad moment, he swore those empty eye sockets stared back, urging him on. Rain pounded down, but he no longer felt cold. A fire ignited in his chest, a fire of truth, justice, and an unspoken vow to the mother he'd never truly known. Jake knelt by the coffin, the flashlight trembling in his grip as it lit up his mother's skeleton, Emily Turner. Rain drummed steadily, dripping from his hood onto his face, but he barely noticed the chill or wet anymore. Before him was the impossible. After 18 years beneath Willow Creek's damp soil, her bones remained pristine, gleaming white like polished pearl, unmarred by time or decay. The skull tilted slightly, as if watching him with hollow sockets. Between the ribs, a faded green scrap, perhaps her burial dress, held its shape, defying the years. But what chilled him most was the note clutched in her skeletal fingers. "They killed me. Find Henry." Jake's mind reeled. He picked up the sodden note, clutching it tight, letting rain blur the ink, but not its meaning. Henry, his father, the man who'd raised him in silence and distance after her death. The man he'd thought was hiding grief, but now, perhaps, a crime. Jake looked at the skeleton again, and for a fleeting, insane moment under the flickering light, he imagined those empty sockets glowing, as if his mother still lived, speaking through cold, white bone. "Mom," he whispered, voice lost in the rain. He touched her skeletal hand, the cold seeping into his fingertips. No flesh, no warmth, yet he felt an uncanny presence, as if Emily Turner's spirit lingered here. He wondered, what kept her like this? No chemicals, no artificial casing, just rotted wood, mud, and this skeleton, a miracle or a curse. Jake slumped against the coffin's edge, rain washing mud and sweat from his face. He recalled high school science. Bones, even in good conditions, decayed over decades. But 18 years under Iowa's wet earth, with rain and bugs, should have reduced her to dust. Yet she lay here, as if asleep, waiting for him. He let out a dry laugh, hollow in the empty cemetery. "What do you want me to do, Mom?" he asked, expecting no reply. But then he looked at the note again, now a wet mess, but legible. "They killed me. Find Henry." They sent a shiver through him. Not just his father. Who else? Family? Neighbors? The whole town of Willow Creek, complicit in burying the truth? Jake felt a smoldering fire flare in his chest. Not fear, but rage. If his mother wasn't at peace, if she'd lain here 18 years for him, he wouldn't turn back. He stood, legs shaky but resolute. He'd find the truth, no matter the cost. He tucked the note into his pocket, gazing at the skeleton one last time. "I'll come back, Mom," he said firmly. "I'll find out what they did." He closed the coffin lid, shielding her remains from the rain, then hastily shoveled dirt back over. But in his mind, those perfect bones were etched deep, a reminder that this story had only begun. Jake drove home through the downpour, his mind a storm of its own as headlights cut through the dark. It was nearly 3 a.m., but exhaustion didn't touch him. Adrenaline and whiskey fueled his veins. The pickup lurched over muddy back roads, beams catching raindrops like 1,000 watching eyes. He couldn't shake the image of his mother's skeleton, pristine, waiting, and that note accusing his father. Back home, he didn't turn on the lights. He set the soaked note from the coffin beside the attic letter on the kitchen table, grabbed a towel to dry his hands, and sat staring at them as if they'd speak. The first letter, in his mother's shaky hand, told him to dig her up. The second, in the same script, pointed to Henry and they. Jake's stomach twisted. He'd lost his mother too young to understand, and his father 3 years ago to cancer. Now he wondered if he'd ever truly known them. He stood, rummaging through a drawer for a cigarette, a habit he'd quit but now craved. Lighting it with a flick, he inhaled deeply, letting smoke dull the lingering chill from the graveyard. He sifted through what he knew about his mother's death. In 2007, he was 8, living in this house with his parents. Emily was gentle, always smiling, though sometimes he caught her sadness. Henry worked at the fertilizer plant a few miles out, a quiet man prone to outbursts. The day she died, it all happened too fast. His father's scream, her body on the kitchen floor, the rushed funeral with a closed casket. Jake frowned, digging deeper into memory. Aunt Mary had said something at the funeral, a phrase he hadn't grasped then. "Henry knows what happened," she'd whispered to a relative, her voice thick with resentment. Jake had thought she was just grieving, but now it echoed like a warning. He stubbed out the cigarette, rose, and decided to search his father's things. His parents' bedroom upstairs hadn't changed since Henry's death. Jake rarely came here, avoiding old ghosts. But now he had no choice. He yanked open the closet, pulling out dusty boxes, bills, tax forms, faded photos of happier days. Then he found a small wooden box, locked with a rusted padlock. No key, but Jake didn't hesitate. He grabbed a hammer from the garage and smashed it open. Inside were letters, handwritten, no envelopes or dates, in a stranger's script, not his parents'. Jake read the first, and his heart stopped. "Henry, it's done. She's no longer a problem. Keep the kid in the dark." The words hit like a freight train. She his mother? And it's done meant what? He flipped to the next letter, but headlights flashed through the window. Someone was coming, at 3 a.m. Jake shoved the letters into his pocket, killed the lights, and peeked through the blinds. A police cruiser pulled up. The door opened, and a tall man stepped out, Sheriff Dan Carter, head of Willow Creek's police and his father's old friend. Jake's palms sweated. Did they know he'd dug up the grave? Or was this part of the they his mother warned about? Jake stood still behind the blinds, his breath slowing as Sheriff Dan Carter's flashlight swept the front yard. Rain tapped steadily on the tin roof, but it couldn't drown out his pounding heart. Carter, tall, salt and pepper hair under a wet sheriff's hat, face etched with hard lines, was a familiar figure in Willow Creek. He'd visited often when Henry was alive, sharing beers and reminiscing. But now, at 3 a.m., his presence felt anything but friendly. Jake stuffed the letters from the wooden box into his jacket, his hand brushing the damp note from his mother's coffin. "They killed me. Find Henry." If Carter was part of they, Jake couldn't let him know about the grave, Not yet. A sharp knock rattled the door, cutting through his thoughts. Jake Turner. Open up. I know you're in there. Carter's voice boomed, low and rough with a hint of menace. Jake took a deep breath, stepping into the kitchen. He couldn't hide. The house was too small, and his mud-caked pickup sat out front, fresh from the cemetery. He flicked on the kitchen light, pulled a chair as if he'd been up working, and opened the door slowly. Sheriff, he said, forcing calm. What brings you here this late? Carter stepped in uninvited, his muddy boots tracking dirt across the floor. He removed his hat, revealing sharp eyes that scanned the room. Someone saw your truck near the cemetery a few hours ago, he said evenly, gaze locked on Jake. What were you doing out there in the middle of the night? Jake's throat went dry. He shrugged, feigning nonchalance. Couldn't sleep. Drove around. What's the cemetery got to do with anything? He glanced at his hands, dirt still under his nails, and quickly shoved them into his pockets. Carter didn't reply immediately. He walked to the table, where the attic letter and coffin note lay scattered. Jake lunged forward, but Carter only glanced at them before turning back. You're too much like Henry, he said, voice dropping. Stubborn, poking into trouble. But you should know, some things aren't worth digging up, literally or otherwise. The word stabbed Jake like a knife. Did he know? Or was it just a vague warning? Jake clenched his jaw, taking a gamble. What's that supposed to mean? What do you know about my dad that I don't? Carter let out a dry laugh, harsh as wind over dead cornfields. Henry was my friend, Jake. But he wasn't a saint. If you're smart, you'll let the past rest. He put his hat back on, heading for the door. Don't make me come back here for nonsense. Then he was gone, leaving Jake in a room now reeking of mud and tobacco. As the cruiser's lights faded, Jake sank into a chair, hands shaking as he pulled out the letters. The second read, she saw everything. If we don't handle it, the whole town will know. Jake's blood ran cold. They didn't just kill his mother. They silenced her because she knew something. Jake didn't sleep after Carter left. He sat in the kitchen, letters spread before him, each word a cut into his past. The rain had eased, but the air hung heavy, damp, as if the house itself sighed with him. He closed his eyes, letting his mind drift to his mother's final days, searching for a clue to explain what he'd read. He remembered more about the day she died, not just her body on the floor, but the days before. Emily Turner had changed. She smiled less, her pale blue eyes often staring into the distance, waiting for something. Once, Jake saw her at this very table with papers in front of her. He asked what she was doing, and she quickly folded them away, forcing a smile. Just grown-up stuff, sweetie, she said. But her voice trembled, and her hand was cold on his hair. Another time, a few days before her death, Jake woke to arguing downstairs. Peeking through the door crack, he saw his parents facing off, his father's face red with anger. You can't tell anyone, Emily. Henry roared, slamming the table. His mother replied, soft but firm. They can't keep doing this. Someone has to know. Jake didn't understand then, but he saw her cry as Henry stormed out, leaving her alone in the dark. Now, those memories cut sharper than ever. His mother knew something big enough to make her a threat. Jake opened his eyes, staring at the letters. The third read, she's threatening to go to a lawyer. Do it fast, Henry, before it all falls apart. Jake gripped the paper, feeling it burn in his hand. His mother didn't die of illness. She was murdered, and his father, the man he'd called Dad, was part of it. He stood, stepping onto the porch. Dawn peeked through gray clouds, a faint orange streak on the horizon. He needed someone who knew more, someone close to his mother. Aunt Mary came to mind. She lived on the town's edge, alone in a small house since her husband died a decade ago. If anyone knew the truth, it was her. Jake went back inside, grabbed his keys, resolved to face the past before it consumed him. Aunt Mary's house sat at the end of a gravel road out of Willow Creek, hidden behind gnarled pines. Jake drove there as the sun rose, its weak light piercing thick fog. He knocked, breath fogging in the chill air. Slow footsteps approached, and the door creaked open, revealing Mary's aged face, disheveled silver hair, pale blue eyes like his mother's, now cloudy with time. Jake, she rasped, voice rough. What are you doing here so early? She wore a baggy sweater, arms wrapped tight against the cold. I need to talk about Mom, Jake said, cutting to the chase. Now. Mary frowned, but didn't press. She stepped aside, letting him in. The small house was cluttered yet warm, smelling of stale coffee. Jake sat in a worn armchair as Mary brewed tea, her trembling hands spilling drops. "What did you find?" she asked, avoiding his gaze. Jake pulled the letters from his pocket, setting them on the table. "These, and a note in Mom's coffin. She said they killed me and told me to find Dad." Mary froze, the teacup halfway to her lips. She turned, face ashen. "You dug up Emily?" Her voice quaked, not with anger, but fear. Jake nodded, recounting it all, the attic letter, the pristine skeleton, the note in her hand. When he finished, Mary sank into a chair, hands covering her face. "God, Emily," she whispered. Then she looked up, eyes red. "I knew she didn't die of illness. I tried telling people, but no one listened." "What do you know?" Jake pressed, voice tight. "Who killed her? Was Dad involved?" Mary took a shaky breath, summoning courage. "Emily found something awful at the fertilizer plant, where Henry worked. They were dumping toxic chemicals into the river, covering it up for profit. She wanted to expose them, but Henry stopped her. Then one night, he came home pale as death, said she'd had an accident. I didn't believe it, but I had no proof." Jake's head buzzed. "So Dad killed her?" "Not exactly," Mary said, voice breaking. "Henry didn't have the guts. But he let someone else do it, people from the plant. Sheriff Carter knew, Jake. He covered it all up." Jake left Mary's house with a storm in his chest. Her words echoed like a death knell. His father didn't kill his mother, but he'd let it happen. And Sheriff Carter, his late-night visitor, was part of it. The fertilizer plant, the poisoned river, his mother's death, all tied by greed and silence. He drove home, but didn't stop. He needed proof, something beyond letters and Mary's story. He racked his brain for anything his father might have kept from the plant. Then it hit him, the shed out back, where Henry stored junk from tools to old papers. Jake parked, ran to the shed, and pried the lock off with a crowbar. Inside was chaos, rusted paint cans, broken saw blades, stacks of moldy boxes. Jake tore through it, hands black with dust and grease. Finally, he found a small metal box with Willow Creek Fertilizer Plant stamped on it. Inside were documents, chemical reports, falsified data, and a handwritten note. "Emily suspects. Handle her before she sees a lawyer." Jake clutched the papers, rage blazing inside him. This was it, proof not just of his mother's murder, but a broader crime against the town. But he couldn't act alone. Carter had warned him, and if he knew Jake was digging deeper, he'd be next. Jake needed a plan and an ally. He thought of Tom Riley, an old high school friend, now a reporter for the local paper in the next county. Tom loved big stories, and this was his chance to break one. Jake stuffed the documents into his bag, locked the shed, and drove out of Willow Creek, eyes forward. Jake met Tom Riley at a dingy diner on the county line, 20 miles from Willow Creek. It was nearly noon, but the place was empty, reeking of grease, with a staticky radio droning weather updates. Tom, shaggy brown hair, wire-rimmed glasses, worn leather jacket, sat in a corner booth, sipping black coffee. He looked up as Jake approached, smirking. "You look like you just dug up a grave, man." Jake didn't smile. He sat, dropping the documents and letters on the table. "You're not wrong," he said, voice low. Then he spilled it all. The attic letter, the perfect skeleton, Mary's confession, the plant's conspiracy. Tom listened, face hardening, scribbling notes furiously. When Jake finished, Tom whistled softly. "This is huge. If you're right, it's not just Henry and Carter. The whole plant leadership could go down. But you need more than this. It's good, but not enough for court." "What then?" Jake asked, tense. Tom tapped his pen, thinking. "I'll dig deeper. Environmental records, old plant workers. But you've got to watch your back. If Carter knows you've got this, you're toast." Jake nodded, fear drowned by resolve. He'd seen his mother lying there, intact after 18 years, as if begging for justice. "I'm not stopping, Tom. They killed her, and I'll make them pay." Tom met his gaze, serious. "All right, but we're in this together now. You're not alone." Jake nodded, a weight lifting slightly. But as he left the diner, his eyes caught a black car parked across the street. No lights, no plates. Someone was watching, and he knew the fight had just begun. Jake drove back to Willow Creek after meeting Tom, his eyes flicking to the rearview mirror. The black car with no plates trailed faintly through the midday fog. He sped up, the pickup rattling on the rutted dirt road, mud splattering the windshield. He wasn't sure who it was, Carter, plant goons, or his own paranoia, but after what he'd uncovered, coincidence was off the table. Back home, he locked the door tight, drew the blinds. He spread the shed documents and letters on the kitchen table, then sat, head in hands. His mind buzzed from sleeplessness and unanswered questions. His mother's perfect skeleton, her note from beyond, his father's letters, all pointed to a truth too vast to grasp alone. He needed rest, but closing his eyes brought her hollow sockets staring back, urging him on. A soft tap at the window jolted him. He grabbed a kitchen knife, heart racing. Peering through the blinds, he saw only a black crow pecking the glass. It croaked once and flew off, leaving Jake with a pounding pulse. He laughed dryly, chiding his nerves. Then came another sound, soft footsteps on the porch. Jake killed the lights, pressed against the wall, knife in hand. The steps paused, then a tall shadow passed the window, faint under the weak moonlight. He held his breath, waiting for a knock or a break-in, but nothing came. The shadow vanished, as if it had never been. Jake waited, then slipped out the back door, scanning the yard. No one, just faint boot prints in the mud, trailing into the cornfield. He locked up again, deciding this house wasn't safe anymore. If someone was watching, he couldn't stay. He packed the papers into a backpack, grabbed his father's old pistol from a drawer, something he'd never thought he'd need. He texted Tom, "Someone's following me. Meet you tomorrow. Stay sharp." Then he drove off, heading for a cheap motel in the next town, hoping for a few hours to regroup. Jake woke the next morning in the motel's musty room, the damp smell stinging his nose. He met Tom at an empty lot near the river running through Willow Creek, where Mary said his mother suspected the plant dumped toxins. The river was a murky streak now, stinking and lifeless, its banks lined with dead trees. Tom carried a camera and a water testing kit, his face set with purpose. "You sure about this?" Tom asked, eyeing the river. "If it's true, it's not just your mom they hurt. This whole town could be living on a chemical time bomb." Jake nodded, clutching the documents. "Mom knew, and they killed her to shut her up. I won't let them get away." Tom began collecting water samples while Jake reviewed the papers. One report stood out. Excess discharge, October 2007. Contain immediately if information leaks. October 2007, when his mother died. Jake's stomach churned. She wasn't just a victim. She was the only one who dared speak. Tom returned, grimacing. "This water's a mess. Lead, ammonia, stuff I can't even name. If the plant's been doing this for 18 years, it's not just murder, Jake. It's environmental crime." Jake nodded, gaze distant. He pictured his mother standing here 18 years ago, seeking proof to stop this. Not a storybook hero, just a mom protecting her son and town. And they killed her for it. "Can you get this in the paper?" he asked Tom. "Sure," Tom said. "But I need more. Official records, witnesses. Will Mary talk?" Jake shook his head. "She's scared, but I'll convince her." He glanced at the river one last time, feeling his mother's spirit nearby, watching. As they left, Jake didn't notice the black car, same as yesterday, parked discreetly behind trees, a camera lens glinting from its window. Jake returned to Mary's that afternoon, carrying the documents and Tom's water samples. She opened the door, face still etched with worry, but didn't let him in right away. "You shouldn't come back, Jake," she said, voice quivering. "They'll know." "Who'll know?" Jake stepped closer. "Carter? The plant? What aren't you telling me?" Mary sighed, finally letting him in. She sat, clutching a teacup for comfort, hands trembling. "I don't want you following Emily's path," she said. She was too stubborn, and look what happened. Jake set the documents down, pointing to the discharge report. "Mom found this, right? She wanted to expose the plant, and they killed her. I've got proof, Aunt Mary, but I need you as a witness." Mary stared at the papers, tears welling. "I knew she suspected the plant. Once, she came here with a jar of river water, cloudy foul. She said she'd send it for testing, but then, she choked up. 2 days later, she was gone." Jake took her hand, voice firm. "I saw Mom in her coffin, Aunt Mary. Her bones were perfect after 18 years, like she's waiting for justice. I can't do this alone." Mary looked up, stunned. "Perfect?" she whispered. "God. Emily." She paused, then nodded slowly. "All right, I'll help you. But if I do, they won't spare me, like they didn't spare her. Jake nodded, relief mixed with dread. He was pulling her into danger, but he had no choice. That night, Jake got a text from Tom. Found old plant records. Meet me at the diner, now. He drove over, but the diner was closed, lights off. Tom stood in the parking lot, face tense. What's up? Jake asked, stepping out. Tom handed him photocopies. Internal logs from 2007. Henry's name's here. He signed off on the dump right before your mom died. But there's another, Daniel Carter. Jake's blood boiled. Sheriff Carter? Tom nodded. He didn't just cover it up, he ordered her death. Handwritten note. Eliminate threat before October 15th. Before Jake could respond, headlights flared. A police cruiser screeched up, stopping short. Carter stepped out, hand on his holster. What are you boys doing? He asked, voice icy. Jake gripped the papers, facing him. I know what you did to my mom. You and Dad killed her. Carter smirked, unfazed. You've got no proof, Jake. And if you did, you think you'd live to use it? He advanced, but Tom raised his camera. I've sent it all to my editor, Tom said, voice shaky but firm. Touch us, and the world knows. Carter paused, eyes darkening. You're playing a dangerous game. He turned back to his car, tossing over his shoulder. Henry chose the town over family. Learn from him. As Carter drove off, Jake and Tom stood under the moonlight. They'd won round one, but Jake knew the cost would rise. Jake didn't head to the motel. He drove back to Willow Creek Cemetery, needing a moment of calm amid the chaos. He stood by his mother's grave, now recovered after his digging. Wind rustled the leaves, whispering through the night. He knelt, touching the stone. Am I doing this right, Mom? He asked, voice hoarse. I found them, Dad, Carter, the plant. But I'm scared I'm not enough. No answer came, but a cold breeze wrapped around him, carrying a faint lavender scent, her perfume. He closed his eyes, picturing her perfect skeleton below, smiling at him. I won't give up, he whispered. I promise. Standing, a thought struck. If she left that note in her coffin, had she hidden more? He needed to check his father's things again. But as he reached his truck, his phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. Stop, or she dies. Jake stared into the dark cornfield, heart pounding. She could only mean Mary. They knew she'd joined him. Jake gripped his phone, the anonymous text looping in his mind. Stop, or she dies. Night-cloaked Willow Creek Cemetery, the weak moonlight glinting off his mother's tombstone. He didn't need to guess. She was Mary, the only one siding with him, daring to break 18 years of silence. Jake leapt into his truck, flooring it toward her house, heart hammering like it had burst. The gravel road to Mary's was pitch black, no streetlights, just the roar of his engine slicing the dark. Her small house loomed ahead, eerily silent. The front door hung ajar, swaying in the breeze, the kitchen light flickering. Jake drew his father's old pistol from his belt, stepping inside slow, breath fogging in the cold. Aunt Mary, he called, voice rough. Silence. He crossed the living room, spotting her spilled tea on the table, still warm. Then a faint moan came from the back. Jake bolted out the rear door, freezing at the sight. Mary lay on the ground, blood seeping from a head wound, her pale blue eyes dim with pain. Jake, she rasped, clutching his shirt as he knelt. They came, told me to shut up. Who did this? Jake demanded, rage and fear trembling in his voice. He propped her up, checking the wound, thankfully shallow, a blunt strike. Carter, Mary whispered. And another, in black. She fainted before saying more. Jake called 911, then texted Tom. Mary's attacked. Carter's involved. Need you now. He stayed until the ambulance arrived, instructing them to take her to a hospital in the next county, safer than here. As they left, Jake stood in the yard, gun clenched. Carter wasn't just covering up. He was eliminating witnesses. Time was up. Jake had to act before they got him. Or Tom. Jake drove to the motel he'd hidden at, needing space to think. He spread the documents, letters, and Tom's notes across the bed, piecing together the puzzle. His mother, Emily, uncovered the plant's toxic dumping. She wanted to blow the whistle, but Henry and Carter, among others, killed her to silence her. Mary's attack was their final warning, stop or die. His phone buzzed, Tom calling. Jake, I traced that text number. It's a burner, untrackable. But I found something else, a former plant worker, Bill Grayson, willing to talk. He quit after your mom's death, lives in Davenport now. What does he know? Jake asked, voice tight. Henry didn't want her dead, Tom said. Carter forced it. Grayson saw them argue that night, when she died. He'll testify, but he's scared of retaliation. Jake nodded, unseen. Meet him now. I'm coming. He hung up, but as he packed, he heard an engine outside. Peeking out, he saw the black car, no plates, idling in the lot, exhaust puffing despite no lights. He didn't wait. Grabbing his bag and gun, he slipped out the back, sprinting across the empty field behind. Heavy footsteps followed, fast and deliberate. Jake spun, seeing a man in black, face masked, holding a metal bar. He raised his gun, shouting, "Stop, or I'll shoot." The man paused, tilting his head as if sizing Jake up, then backed into the shadows. Jake didn't fire. He wasn't ready to kill, not yet. But as the figure vanished, Jake knew he was marked. He ran to his truck, peeling out into the night toward Davenport, chasing Grayson, the last hope to expose the truth. Jake reached Davenport at midnight, meeting Tom and Bill Grayson in a rundown house on the outskirts. Grayson was a gaunt old man, white hair thinning, eyes sunken from fear and booze. He sat in an armchair, clutching a whiskey bottle, voice quaking as he spoke. "I worked at the plant 20 years, Grayson began. In 2007, we dumped chemicals in the river, orders from above. Emily, your mom, was a secretary there. She found out, threatened to call the feds. Henry begged her to stop, but she wouldn't." Jake clenched his fists, voice thick. "Who killed her?" Grayson took a shaky breath. "Carter. He came to your house that night, said he'd fix it. Henry fought him, but Carter knocked him out. I was there. I saw Carter strangle Emily on the kitchen floor. When Henry woke, he cried, but he didn't dare act. Carter threatened to kill you too if he talked." Jake's head buzzed. His father didn't kill her, but he let her die. Out of fear, weakness. "Why didn't you say anything?" he growled. Grayson bowed his head. "I was scared. Carter kills without blinking. I quit, ran. But I kept this." He pulled an old USB from his pocket. Recording of Carter and Henry arguing that night. "I saved it to protect myself." Tom plugged it into his laptop. The audio crackled, Carter's cold voice. "She has to die, Henry, or your whole family's done." Then his mother's scream, Henry's futile pleas. Jake turned away, tears streaking his face. He'd known the truth, but hearing it was a fresh wound. "Will you testify?" Tom asked Grayson. Grayson nodded slowly. "If you keep me safe." Jake stood, wiping his eyes. "I'll protect you. We're ending this." Jake, Tom, and Grayson returned to Willow Creek at dawn, armed with the USB and all their evidence. Tom had contacted a major paper's editor, who'd run the story with solid proof. But first, Jake wanted Carter one last time. He walked into the sheriff's office, pistol hidden under his jacket. Carter sat behind his desk, unsurprised. "You're more stubborn than Henry," he said, smirking. Jake slammed the USB down. "I've got proof you killed my mom. The press will know. You're done." Carter laughed dryly, hand easing toward a drawer. "Think you're a hero, Jake? This is Willow Creek. No one cares about truth." He drew a gun, but Jake was faster, aiming at Carter's chest. "I don't want to kill you," Jake said, voice shaking but steady. "But I will if you make me." Carter stared, eyes darkening. "You're just like Emily. She said that too. Look how it ended." Before Carter could fire, the door burst open. Tom and 2 county deputies stormed in, guns on Carter. "Drop it, Sheriff," one barked. Tom had called them, leveraging the story to force action. Carter lowered his weapon, cuffed, and led away. Jake watched him go, a weight lifting. But it wasn't over. The plant remained, others unpunished. A week later, Tom's story hit the front page. Murder and environmental crime in Willow Creek. Carter was arrested, along with 3 plant executives. Mary recovered in the hospital, testifying with Grayson. The river cleanup began, though it'd take years. Jake became a focal point, but he didn't want fame, just his mother's peace. He returned to Willow Creek Cemetery one last time, carrying lavender flowers, her favorite scent. He knelt by her grave, placing them on the stone. "I did it, Mom," he said, voice breaking. "They've paid." A breeze carried lavender through the air. Jake closed his eyes, picturing her perfect skeleton below, finally at rest. He stood, gazing at the sprawling cornfields, feeling her smile from afar. As he walked away, a black crow perched on her stone, croaked once, and flew off. Jake didn't look back. He'd won justice, for her and himself.